Star Wars Jedi Survivor is so close to being amazing. Like, it's actually so close yet so far away at the same time. The game is not an outright disaster like some people would have you believe. I mean, unless you're playing the broken PC port. Nor is the game fundamentally flawless, and I don't care what Dr. Disrespect said about it. It's still got some holes and some issues that are clearly holding it back. However, it is a fascinating game, and it still has the opportunity to grab a hold of greatness and go beyond where it is right now. Now, I'm sure most of you have heard about or experienced yourself a lot of the issues firsthand. The game is a technical nightmare at the moment. I mean, that much is obvious. Jedi Survivor displays itself like this, like ideally this is kind of how it should be, but really this is a bit more of an accurate depiction of the game at the moment.
I thought we agreed not to talk about that.
But I've done pretty much nothing with my life except play this game since it's released, and I want to talk about why I think this game is incredible in some areas and where its shortcomings are as well. So this is going to be a full in-depth review of Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and if this doesn't go without saying, this is your warning right now, there will be spoilery things for Jedi Survivor in this video, so just a heads up. Anyways, to me, it's like actually painful how close this game comes to being a genuinely outstanding game that I would consider a masterpiece. It's right at the very edge of greatness, but doesn't quite get there for me. So I feel like we should address the biggest issue right away. We got to get to the elephant in the room. The performance and the technical aspect of this on PC is genuinely unplayable. It's broken to a point where EA literally had to issue a statement saying that, hey, we know the game is horribly unoptimized and physically doesn't work on PC, and they are actively working on a fix for that for certain machines and whatnot. And so they are clearly looking into this, and while the performance is literally unplayable on PC, I wouldn't necessarily say it's all that much better on console. I played this on PlayStation 5, and even then, the performance is not amazing. It's not even what I would consider to be that good. The thing is, you can see the vision of what this game should be like all the time. There will be these moments where it kicks into 60 frames and even is able to maintain that for a little while, and when it's running in that, you're like, wow, this is actually a really good experience. And then, but time and again, it would kick down to like 20 or like 30 frames, and it was like almost unwatchable. Like, I was literally sitting here watching a Star Wars PowerPoint. I've said it before, like, visuals and graphics aren't necessarily the biggest deal in the world to me. Yeah, they're important, but in the case of Jedi Survivor, the thing that's really a problem is the visual inconsistency. Like, these moments where it would kick into 60 frames and then it would drop down to like basically 20 or 30. That kind of like jumping between those two things was really jarring. And also, just like, the game doesn't look quite as nice as I was expecting. Part of that is because on console, I had to play the game in performance mode. And performance mode can barely even hold 30 frames as is, and if you take it out of performance mode, you're pretty much going to be playing the entire game in about 20 to 30 frames. I'm certainly disappointed in the performance of the game, but I can't say I'm necessarily surprised. The game did get delayed, and I don't think there's ever been a game that has got delayed for any significant amount of time that has come out and it was like, oh, it's fine now. You know what I mean? Like, that's always a terrible sign. We should have taken that as a giant red flag that, like, this was not going to come out buttery smooth. It was going to have some issues that still need to be ironed over. Just like the amount of polish on the game, it feels like, I don't know how to explain it, but it's like it needs to have like one more layer for it to really get where it wanted to be from the start. Like, I can see the vision of what this game is trying to be, but it's like it needed one more coat of polish. Well, I'm not going to spend the whole time harping on this game's bad performance because that's been done to death. I'm sure you guys already know this. It is an important factor for anybody who's considering picking up the game. The good news is, whether you're playing on PC or console, they are working on fixes, I'm sure, and I guarantee after a couple of patches, this stuff will be running better. It will be running more smoothly, more consistently. There might be some hitches here and there, even with the patches, but I think right now, if you have not purchased the game or are considering it, and this kind of thing is a big deal to you, it's not currently in the best playable state. But otherwise, like, frame rate stuff aside, even like the resolution of, again, I had to run it in performance mode to even play the game, the resolution would jump all over the place from like these really gorgeous looking visuals and cutscenes, and then it would drop down to another cutscene that was like, it was like just like a 3D model of it. It was like barely even like textured over, and the lighting was all janky and weird and stuff. Like, it was just the most inconsistent experience. Like, if the whole game had been textured over and running at this kind of like low resolution, it would probably probably be better than if it had just jumped all over the place like it does now. It's just so jarring, and that's kind of was my biggest problem as far as performance goes, is that it very often took me out of the experience when weird stuff like this would happen. We'll talk a bit more about optimization and what I recommend doing for that stuff a little bit later in the video, but I do want to talk about the actual game for a moment. So the first thing I want to start with is combat, and Jedi Survivor's combat is really, really amazing. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's not exactly Dark Souls combat, but it's the next best thing, and I mean that very sincerely. The core combat formula is very rock, paper, scissors, but the way that it interacts with all your different like lightsaber stances and different methods you can use for combat and the skill trees and all that stuff is actually excellent. The combat is literally the highlight of this game in my opinion. The biggest mistake they could have made is make the combat like so unbelievably unsatisfying. Like if you somehow manage to make it unfun to use a lightsaber, then you've clearly done it wrong. But Jedi Survivor, I am happy to report that they absolutely nail it here. It's genuinely the thing that I do believe got the most attention and is the most like dialed in. And the combat directly interacts with the game's progression that I think it also does super well. Like it's not a vanilla system where you have to use one weapon one kind of way. The great thing about Jedi Survivor is that there is so much variety in the way that you can customize your stances and your playstyle and everything. Like for example, different stances will be better in different scenarios. I typically ran like crossguard and double-bladed. Those were my favorite. Double-bladed is better for encounters where there's like multiple enemies. You're going to run into a lot of situations where you have like, I don't know, 10 or 12 targets at a time, and that seems to be more cut out for that. The crossguard is like very slow, it has slow windups and everything, but it hits for like a lot of block damage, meaning you can break people's guard pretty easily. It's stuff like that you can sort of customize of what the scenario is upcoming, and the way that it interacts with its skill tree, you get different abilities as you go on, and you can completely change and customize your skill tree, you know, to whatever you prefer. Jedi Survivor doesn't force you into any particular method of play, but they give you enough options to where like you really do want to specialize in like maybe one or two. You're on your first playthrough, you're really not going to be able to, you know, upgrade every single lightsaber stance and get its entire skill tree unless you really take your time. Most people are going to upgrade a couple and, you know, find their favorites and stick with that for the rest of the game. Speaking of customization, the way that you can really make your lightsaber your own and even evolve it and experiment with different ones throughout the game, not even necessarily in relation to combat, but just its aesthetics is so well done here. Like I actually think it's one of its strongest suits is they really nail not only the ability to customize your lightsaber, but even your blaster or, you know, BD1 or Cal, like whatever. Like you can customize virtually every aspect of the aesthetics of this game, and they give you tons of good options for it. So big plus there. I think the lightsaber is really the highlight of that stuff, no pun intended. When it comes to bosses, I have like nothing but positives to say about them as well. They're actually excellent. I had a great time with them. Well, once again, they're not exactly like a Dark Souls boss. It's a little more simple and formulaic than that. That's fine. There was not a single encounter in this game that I was like, it's not fun, or I dreaded doing it, or I felt like it was like bullshit in any way. They're a little more like simple and straightforward than a boss like that, but like it really works for this game and its core combat. The only minor downside to that is some of the boss fights can feel like very samey, even, you know, across the board. For example, there's a few encounters in the game where you fight the same enemy multiple times. Like the Dagon fight, you fight him a couple, you know, encounters throughout the game. And while they're all genuinely different, he's got different tricks up his sleeve in each different encounter. Largely, they are still very much like the same rhythm and formula, and you kind of feel like a little bit of like been there, done that, but it's not even that big of a deal. So when it comes to like the core combat loop and enemy encounters, all that stuff, like it gets genuinely an A+ for me. They knocked it out of the park. The only thing that's a problem is when in certain encounters, again, performance will dip below like 60 frames. That can really hurt the experience because a lot of the, like, for example, in boss fights, a lot of the frame data kind of depends on you watching it in 60 frames. And so if it dips below that or even drops to like 30, boss fight and encounters can feel like really janky. And again, that's just a performance thing that hopefully they will smooth out, but in terms of like actual fundamentals, the bosses are excellent. So again, while stuff like the core combat loop and the bosses and customization pretty much gets as close to perfect as you can, I will say the weakest part of like the meat and potatoes of the game, in my opinion, is the level design. For the most part, it's pretty good, but it's not perfect. And I do think that I'm going to be making some comparisons to God of War Ragnarok because it's a game I played recently. It's pretty fresh in my mind, and and I think is a good example of how a game does that right. So I do have a few criticisms for the level design. Going back to the performance thing, one of the things you're going to notice as you play through Jedi Survivor, and if you're paying attention, you're really going to pick up on this, there are a lot of hidden loading screens, and even some actions that like are physically, it doesn't make sense why you can't do it until the level loads in. Like when you're walking around Grease's bar, for example, and you're trying to go outside, the doors will stay shut until the level loads in front of you, and you can clearly see that's what's going on. As soon as the door opens, the textures aren't even properly loaded in. It's like a lot of stuff like that kind of takes me out of the game when it happens, and to be fair, for the most part, they do their hidden loading screens very well. Like, for example, when you're riding on an elevator, that's pretty much a glorified loading screen. Also, the obvious ones are when you're in the ship going to a new location. That is very clearly a, hidden loading screen that makes sense in the context of the game. The ones that I really didn't like were when it would, like, kind of bar me out of a door because the game was still loading, and I didn't know that. It's like, I would walk up to a door, it wouldn't open, so I'd assume I can't go through it, and then I'd walk away only to be stuck, and then go back to that same door, and it would open again. It's like very clearly things that are like not quite up to polish, and not to mention the whole like more open world segment on the moon that you're going to be traveling back and forth to a lot. This area does not run well at all. You can be in the wild doing all these different cool things, but it just doesn't run that good. When you're doing the main levels and you're in the, or even like dungeons you're supposed to be in, these like more linear paths and levels, the optimization and consistency was usually pretty good. Not perfect, but it would typically run at 60 FPS when you're in the like main areas you're supposed to be. But when you're doing these more open world things, it was like almost unplayable, even on console in this performance mode thing. Like it was just clearly not done. And even visually, it doesn't have that extra coat of polish that you would expect for a game like this to have. It's the inconsistency that really kind of took me out of the game. And above all else, the thing that annoyed me the most, and I felt like was the most sloppy, was actually conveying to the player of how they're supposed to traverse the level and where they're supposed to be going in some cases in the game. And those of you who have played through Jedi Survivor will know what I'm talking about. And this is particularly rough in the middle of the game. There's a lot of levels where like it just is not clear at all how you're supposed to interact with them. And again, this is why I was saying I was going to compare it to God of War. In Ragnarok, it's one of those things in video games where if it's done well, you don't even think about it. You only notice it if it's done poorly. And I notice in God of War Ragnarok, like the way that you're supposed to get around and like climb on things and what is, interactable and what isn't is like conveyed to the player really well. Like all that stuff is seamless. I guess that's the best way to put it, is God of War Ragnarok does its level traversal and design in a very seamless way that isn't jarring or off-putting or like confusing. Jedi Survivor just doesn't have quite that level of polish that you would expect for this kind of level design. There's a lot of like textures of like that are just confusing of like, am I supposed to interact with this or not? Can I climb this thing? Am I supposed to wall run on this? Like for example, this situation right here, you're actually not supposed to jump from the grate to the pole, even though it kind of looks like you are. You're supposed to then drop down, wall run on this thing, and then jump to the pole. But it's like, partly it's bad because the texture doesn't even load in when you're on this part from the start. But even worse, this is just one example, but there's like a ton of instances in the game where like, am I supposed to interact with this thing or not? You'll probably be jumping off of cliffs quite often, just experimenting and trying to figure out like what you can and can't interact with. I just don't think it was quite as neatly done or as seamless as something like Ragnarok did. It's not like unplayable or anything, but it was like kind of annoying. The game is like sort of a headache to figure out how you traverse in. A lot of the level design is clunky and it's like cumbersome, and it's just more or less sloppy in a way where I feel like if they had a little more time to really like catalyze this and look at it with a closer eye, they could make it to where it was that seamless experience that I feel like Ragnarok does so well. I'm not even saying that game was perfect with it, but Jedi Survivor is a case where like because they did it wrong, it's a lot more obvious. In the open world stuff, it's usually fine because it's more of the sense of like, what should I go do? It's like this open question of like, where should I go? That kind of thing. But when you're doing the more linear levels in the game, it's less of a case of like, oh, where should I go? It's more like, how do I get to where I need to go? It's less exploratory and more frustrating than anything. More the feeling of like, I know where I need to be, but I have no clue how to get there. And there's a lot of cases like that in the game that I was just like, oh my god, it was a headache at some points. That is all to say, I do think like the core level design and like how you go interacting with the game's puzzles and stuff. Like, even some of the optional puzzles are a little frustrating. Their designs and layouts are a little annoying. It's not that the puzzles are broken or anything, but it's like the layouts of how you actually interact with them can be a little frustrating. But, you know, more so to the point, the main quest level layout designs could have been done a little bit more tightly crafted. That's like my only real criticism. Another small one is the fact that you're going to be going to the same places frequently throughout the game. There's a lot of like back and forth between the same planets, and again, a lot of that is because it saves on budget and dev time. I get that, but it does mean that there's a lot of like what feels like filler throughout the game, not only in terms of the core gameplay, but also some of the level design. Again, there's like a lot of encounters where you fight the same enemy over and over again, and then even in the story, you're going to be jumping back and forth between these different places in what feels like a little bit of filler stuff. But, you know, again, it's not like outright unplayable or offensive or anything, but let's go ahead and get to that real quick. Let's go ahead and talk about the story. Not going to get into every single little detail about the story in this video, but I think for the most part, it's pretty well done. I think the game opens up super strong. Like the intro and the opening bit is exceptional. I'd say all of Act 1 is really solid. I do admit the game kind of sags a little bit in the middle. I think a lot of that stuff is, you know, what is very clearly like filler arc kind of things where they need to stretch out the game's time, and I get that, but this is the part in the story where there's just like a lot of runaround. Like, we got to go to this planet and grab this thing, we got to go over here and then get this thing, we got to go back and then drop this thing off. Like, it's a lot of like, I don't know, like chores, and again, like in the story, like I'm not like angry at it, but it's just like you can tell this is where the filler stuff is. In the meantime, of course, we get our setups for all of our players in this game. Like, we get some really good stuff with, I really like all the Marin and Cal stuff. Like, that stuff is really well done. I like the Seer stuff as well. There are a lot of really good character arcs and moments that are built into this kind of like middle section of the game that I don't love from a story perspective, but it all pays off and it all leads up to the last act where like things really get going. There's this slow period in the middle, and then once you get to the final third of the game, like it actually goes off the wall in the best way possible. I love the last act of this game. Also, more to the point, it doesn't feel like they're just doing crazy things for the sake of it, because like they don't feel contrived. All of the wild stuff that happens in this game are moments that were built up and earned throughout the course of the game. Like for example, when Darth Vader shows up, they're not just shoving Darth Vader in to make, you know, bearded fat guys happy. This is like, it makes sense in the context of the story why he would show up. Sure, it's a little bit of like a fan servicey moment, but it's like, it doesn't overstay its welcome. It's short, sweet, and to the point, and it's like very effective and impactful. I love the use of Darth Vader in this game. Like, it was great. And then also, you know, with the last act twist where Bode is basically the one who betrayed you, you kind of empathize with him a little bit. He has its reasons and everything. It's still twisted what he did, but you can kind of understand the complexity of the situation. And it was built up and earned throughout the game. There's little moments and little pieces of dialogue that he almost kinds of hints that his betrayal is coming if you're paying attention. And of course, this means like Bode is the real main villain the whole time. All of the villain stuff with Dagon and Ravis, like, they're good, but of course they're like red herring villains, and they're just, you know, not particularly the most compelling for the reasons we just discussed. So once again, for lack of a better word, those are basically like the filler villains, but that's fine because the real main villain that's satisfying from the context of the story perspective is like really well handled, and I have no problems there. The actual plot of the game is honestly not horribly interesting. It's like, oh, we need to find this compass to get to this place called Tanalorr that's like, you know, hidden and safe from the Empire. That's the idea. And the entire middle portion of the game that I was telling you is filler is literally just like running around and finding things to get that or whatever. Like, there's a lot of run around involved in that situation, and that's pretty much the whole plot. Is like, we got to find this thing to get to this place. That's it. But of course, that's not really the point. The meat of this game is how Cal, you know, how his character develops and how his relationship with Marin develops, and obviously the betrayal from Bode and the loss of Seer and so on. Like, all that stuff is the actual point of the game. It's just that the plot is kind of built around that fact so that those things can happen. It's fine. I honestly have no issue with the plot. It's just that it's kind of basic, you know? It's like nothing I didn't expect, but I really like the character stuff in this game, which again is the actual point. But if you're looking for some like really crazy and unexpected plot, then this game is not really it. If you like a lot of good character stuff, then this game does a great job at that. Getting away from the story for a second, the other thing I wanted to mention was like side content. Like if you're only doing main quest stuff strictly and literally only pursuing that, I'm pretty sure the game is going to take you about 20 hours or so. But if you're doing side content, you know, a lot of these like bounty hunter fights and like otherwise just like exploring dungeons and trying to get more perks or other loot and stuff like that, the game will probably take you a lot longer. And the side content is usually pretty good. Like obviously you can tell it's a little bit less polished than the main, you know, moments in this game, and that's fine. Every game's got filler to some extent. I get that, and that's okay. And I think that Jedi Survivor does it pretty well. There's a lot of stuff to do. There's a lot of variety in that stuff to do. The only problem is, once again, like I said, like when you're doing side content, particularly in the open world parts of the game, the performance is just so bad. Like you can tell this was not even ready to be done. So it kind of discourages you from pursuing that stuff because the game just does not feel or look nice to play. In those cases, you're like, well, I may as well just go do main content stuff again because hopefully the game will at least work. Once again, that will most likely be alleviated to some extent as patches come out. I mean, that's the idea, that's the hope. We'll see. But I guess that was my own problem with side content. It was just, it didn't feel good to play because the game ran so poorly when I was doing said side content. But as a whole experience, this is why I was saying like it gets so close to being what is an actual masterpiece, because it's a game that has fundamentally awesome combat and bosses. The lightsaber usage and all that stuff, the player progression, the core combat loop is so good. The customization is amazing. The story is really serviceable. It's got great character stuff. Maybe it's got a little bit of filler arcs and whatnot, but that's fine. But unfortunately, it suffers from really bad performance even on console, which again, hopefully gets fixed. A little bit of clunky level design, but again, forgivable and still serviceable. And really, you can just tell that in all aspects of the game, it doesn't have that like what feels like the final level of polish, that one more pass where they really make sure everything's pristine. It almost gets there, but doesn't quite make it. Like it's so close, and that's why I said it literally hurts me. And so, you know, it's a game with fundamentally solid mechanics and a story and everything. Like on paper, it's great, but if you're considering the game or just want to know what I think about it, if you should purchase this on PC, I would say wait until it's genuinely fixed. On console, I might even wait too. I don't know if I would pick it up just yet until some more patches come out and the game could be more consistent. It's playable on PlayStation 5, which is where I played it at, but even so, there's a bunch of moments in the game where it's like, yikes, this is just not done, bro. Like it's not a final product yet, unfortunately. It gets so close, but no cigar, unfortunately. Would I recommend this game? Definitely, but after it's been fixed, and hopefully that is sooner rather than later. But anyways, that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.